Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 249. The Viscount. Percival George Whittle was born at Constantinople, Turkey on the 9th of August 1854. Percy's grandfather, Charlton Whittle, was English and moved to Turkey by 1814 when he married Madeleine Giraud, who was of French extraction. Percy's father, Charlton Jr., married Elsie Icard in Turkey and they had 11 children, Percy being the sixth child. Percy was born into an English merchant family and was educated in England, multilingual, and was employed by the large Far East trading company Jardine Matheson and Co. He came out on the Bowen to Australia in 1879 and stated his occupation was a commission agent. It seems upon his arrival in Australia that he went directly to Mount Victoria. On the 22nd of December 1879 in the Sydney Morning Herald, a wedding was announced. Percy George Whittle married Grace Mountford Perry on the 26th of November at St Peter's Anglican Church at Mount Victoria, Hartley, New South Wales. Percy was 25 and Grace, who was known as Gwen, was 19. Gwen was the daughter of John and Annie Perry, who owned Perry's Hotel. Percy and Gwen had 11 children. Their firstborn was in September 1880 at Lithgow, New South Wales, and they lived at Hartley, just south of Lithgow. Their firstborn was announced in the Sydney Morning Herald. Whittle on the 16th of September at the residence of her father at Mount Victoria, the wife of Percy George Whittle of China, of a daughter. Following the death of his father-in-law, John Perry, in 1880, Whittle gave up international trade and focused his attentions on Mount Victoria. He now assisted his mother-in-law Annie in running her hotel, and sensing the opportunities that the Mount offered, he began involving himself in town activities, eventually becoming a member of the Cemetery Trust, Public School Board, Progress Association, Reserve Trust, and School of the Arts. By September 1883, the Perry family business was doing well enough for Annie Perry to contemplate expansion, and while continuing to operate her smaller premises, she purchased the Imperial Hotel across the road. It was an opportune moment, for the previous year a consortium of private Mount Victoria citizens and local businessmen had organised the clearing of a track through the bush to the top of the steep descent overlooking the caves. This was now promoted as the shortest route for those coming from Sydney, and by April 1883 a coach was reported to have operated weekly from Mount Victoria. Caves visitors now had a viable choice, and the new route soon attracted a share of travellers. On the 15th of April 1885, in the Bega Gazette and Eden District, or Southern Coast Advertiser, there's an article titled A Gigantic Hotel. We understand the tenders are about to be called by a well-known firm for the erection in Sydney of a colossal hotel, compared with which all others in the colony will sink into significance. Plans and specifications have already been prepared and show that the building is to contain between 300 and 400 rooms, and in being intended that the luxury of a bath with hot and cold water laid on will be attached to every bedroom. The style of architecture is said to be similar to the celebrated Grand Hotel at San Francisco, and the name will be identical. This magnificent building will be situated in Charlotte Place, not far from Petty's Hotel, and the estimated cost is to be £80,000. The lease has been secured for 31 years by Percy G. Whittle, the present manager of the Imperial Hotel at Mount Victoria, who hopes to be in possession in about 18 months. A little over 2 years into her proprietorship of the Imperial Hotel, Annie Perry stepped aside in February 1886 and placed her son-in-law in charge. And on the 27th of April 1886 in the Sydney Morning Herald at Mount Victoria. At a crowded meeting on Saturday night at the Mount Victoria Hall, it was decided to start a relief fund in the aid of widows and orphans of the men killed in the Lithgow Valley Colliery Company's mine. Mr. Percy G. Whittle was elected Honorary Secretary and Treasurer. There was an advertisement for Percy's Imperial Hotel on the 23rd of October 1886 in the Melbourne Australia Asian, and he seemed to advertise widely at this time.
to all seeking a holiday and perfect rest, invigorating air, enchanting scenery and wonderful sights. The Imperial Hotel is noted for its site being no less than 3,600 feet above the sea and is admitted by tourists to be the finest and most luxurious hotel in the colonies. Private suites, billiards, lawn tennis, the leading papers filed. For further particulars as to the route, the sights to be seen and the cost of the trip, apply to the Tourist Bureau in Bridge Street, Sydney, or to the undersigned Percy Whittle, who will reserve rooms on receipt of a letter or telegram. It seems that Percy Whittle was very much the driving force behind making sure that this new road had been created to have the most direct route to the caves. And it seemed that the government had spent some money, but the men really at their own expense made the route passable. In November 1886, there was a letter written to the Sydney Morning Herald that described that there was a good government road still under alteration, but regularly maintained and in excellent order. The word had got out and the impact was enormous. With a good road, the distance was shortened and Mount Victoria's hotels prospered. The person who they thought was the principal guiding spirit behind this letter was Percy George Whittle. At the Imperial Hotel, Percy spent heavily. In 1888, to service guests on his now daily runs to the caves, he built a spacious weatherboard halfway house at Upper Run that was renamed Hampton in 1892, where he established his brother's Fred's family. However, this burnt down in June 1889, but was quickly replaced. At the same time, he was improving the size and quality of his hotel stables. And on the 28th of March 1888, in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, trustees appointed at Mount York Recreation Reserve in Mount Victoria, and it included Percy George Whittle. On the 5th of May 1888, in the Sydney Morning Herald, Mount Victoria to Jenolan Caves. The Imperial line of coaches leaves the Imperial Hotel and Caves daily. This is the shortest, cheapest, and admitted by all who have travelled by it since the new road to the Grand Arch was completed, by far the best route. The drive alone over the finest scenery of the Blue Mountains is worth the journey. For particulars apply to Percy G. Whittle of the Imperial Hotel in Mount Victoria. It was Whittle's coaches that carried Lord and Lady Carrington on their second visit to the caves in April 1889. The horses were praised for their condition, speed and stamina. When a small party of guests, hard-pressed for time, in January 1889 were delivered to the caves in record time, they were so impressed that they acclaimed Percy in the Freeman's Journal and said that he possessed the best teams on the mountains. And on the 23rd of January 1890, in the Illustrated Sydney News, there was an account of the writer going through the Blue Mountains and recording their trip. And there's mention of Whittle's halfway house. Mr. Percy Whittle, the proprietor of the Imperial Hotel at Mount Victoria, knew what he was about when he built this house of call. It is capitally situated for sport and forms an exceedingly pleasant break in the day's journey as you drive to and from the caves. It was burnt down last year and was rebuilt. During the interim, nothing but the blackened ruins remained, but coach passengers partook by lunch on the wayside amidst the whirlwinds which carried them blinding clouds of gravel, which got into the butter and made the festive sandwich racy of the soil. It was time to move on, and we take Whittle's coach, which meets the Jenolan vehicle at this point, and we proceed. On the 6th of January 1891, Percy is listed as living in Mount Victoria and is a coach proprietor. The Illustrated Sydney News described Whittle as the proprietor of the leading hotel in the town, and during this season it is said that no less than 50 horses are employed here, and the establishment contains the largest livery stable next to Cobb & Co. to be found in the Western District, as well as servicing local sites, with 4 in-hand drags and carriages all ready for the use of its visitors. Percy Whittle's golden years were about to come to an abrupt end. At the beginning of 1890, he ran into financial trouble. It's most likely he would have borrowed heavily and was consumed by the financial collapse of the early 1890s. By mid-1890 it was all over, and a Sydney finance company was advertising for a new first-class man to manage the Imperial Hotel. Percy was forced to relinquish his hotel, and it seems that he was thrown a lifeline, as in early 1892 there were advertisements for Whittle's Pioneer Line coaches that began to appear in the press, offering a daily service to the caves. An advertisement featured in 1892. Whittall's Pioneer Line and Coaches. Whittall's Line is the oldest established on the Blue Mountains and the first to open up communication with the Jenolan Caves via Mount Victoria. It is thoroughly efficient and cannot be excelled. 3 relays of horses are set for the run to the caves, with a daily coach guaranteed to reach its destination in time for the afternoon's inspection. As the proprietor does not trust to managers, but looks after the business himself, he can, with his long experience as the pioneer of the route, safely undertake to give his patrons thorough satisfaction. There's a timetable for leaving the Grand Hotel and going to the Jenolan Caves. Then there's another one leaving from the Grand Hotel and going to Wentworth Falls. It says, remember, Whittall's is the Pioneer Line. The proprietor in 12 years has never known to disappoint a passenger, miss a train or have an accident of any kind. Book by his coaches for comfort, safety and time. The arrangements are as perfect as they can be made. Letters and telegrams promptly attended to P.G. Whittall, proprietor. The Whittall coaches now departed from George Hubbard Cooper's Manor House. Cooper had purchased his guest house in 1887 and added extensions, and in October 1890 reopened it as a licensed first-class hotel. The promotion of the Pioneer Line coaches did not begin until early 1892, so it is possible that Percy may have entered an arrangement or even been employed by Cooper at the time that he had developed the manor. Whittall was responsible for the management of the coaching arrangements for important guests like Lord Jersey and the Duchess of Buckingham and Chandos, who visited the caves in January 1893. Even with Cooper's support, Whittall still nevertheless faced strong competition in his efforts to regain his position as the leading coach proprietor in Mount Victoria. Not only were the Royal and Imperial hotels running services to the caves, but the management of his old hotel was now in the hands of John Tabret, who was an experienced horseman and businessman who would later establish a major coaching operation in Katoomba. In short time, Tabret was at the Imperial and aggressively re-established that hotel's reputation. A report in the press in June 1891 said the Imperial is forging ahead. A fair amount of passengers are daily carried through the caves by Imperial coaches. Tabret reopened the temporarily closed Imperial Halfway House at the Upper Run, and in November 1891 launched an advertising campaign to promote refreshed and renamed Imperial line of coaches. It seems that this was almost simultaneous with the promotion of Whittall's Pioneer Line. Tabret departed the Imperial Hotel at the end of 1892, and it seems that the large Pioneer advertisements also soon ceased. In the end, however, Whittall's attempt to re-establish himself was not successful, and he departed Mount Victoria by November 1894. Almost certainly his leaving was precipitated by the issue of a warrant for his arrest. In May 1894 in Sydney, in the Police Gazette, a warrant has been issued by the Water Bench for the arrest of Percy George Whittall, charged with having on the 5th day of December 1893 uttered a certain forged order for an advertisement in the Cook's Australian Travellers' Gazette with intent to defraud. Offender is about 38 years of age, 6 foot high, thin build, dark complexion, 3 months' growth of a dark beard, very long neck, wears a low collar, dressed when last seen in a black coat and vest, grey trousers and a hard black hat. Formerly kept the Imperial Hotel at Mount Victoria and was employed at one time as a canvasser for the Australian Widows' Fund Society. Complainant William O. Woolcock of Hunter Street. And on the 20th of June 1894 in the Police Gazette, Percy George Whittall, charged by warrant with uttering a certain forged order for an advertisement with intent to defraud, has been arrested by the Sydney Police and remanded. On the 10th of August 1894 in the Sydney Evening News, a respectable-looking man named Percy George Whittall was at the Water Police Court today, remanded for a week on light bail on 2 charges of having forged orders for payment of money. The evidence showed in each case that the accused was a canvasser in the employ of Thomas Cook & Co., and that he took orders to the office of the firm representing them to be genuine. He paid commission on both the orders. The orders were shown to be forgeries. He was allowed bail. On the 29th of September 1894 in the Sydney Evening News, Percy George Whittall pled not guilty at the Court of Sessions yesterday to having an indictment charging him with having forged an order for an advertisement with a second count for uttering. The accused had been employed by Thomas Cook & Sons to canvass for advertisements for their Travellers' Gazette. On the 5th of January last, he gave the firm an order for an advertisement purported to have been signed by Mr. Catlett, Secretary of the New South Wales Zoological Society, authorising the insertion of an advertisement regarding these zoological gardens for a period of 12 months at the price of £10 paid quarterly. Whitall told Mr. Woolcock, Cook's manager, that Mr. Catlett had given him the order and he had received £2 as commission. The advertisement duly appeared, but it was subsequently ascertained that Mr. Catlett had never authorised its insertion. For the defence, it was stated that the accused had sole control of the advertisements, and advertisements were frequently inserted on spec. When he signed the order in question, he had no fraudulent intent, and if the Zoological Society had refused to pay for it, he would have paid for it himself. After a lengthy deliberation, the jury found him guilty, with a recommendation to mercy on account of the latitude allowed him by the firm in the management of the paper, and he was remanded for sentence. And on the 2nd of October 1894 in the Sydney Evening News, His Honour said he was of the opinion that this was a case that could very well come within the provisions of the First Offenders Act, and he would therefore pass a sentence of 12 months' imprisonment to be suspended, however, upon Whitall entering into recognisances to be of good behaviour during the period in question. On the 19th of June 1895 in the Sydney Evening News, Percy George Whitall of Webb Street, Burwood, had declared bankruptcy as he was out of employment. He'd never been insolvent before. His present failure was caused by the loss in the Imperial Hotel at Mount Victoria. He had a wife and 9 children. However, only 2 months later, on the 8th of October 1895, an imposter, a man who gives the name of Douglas Carnegie, who's been passing as Viscount Carnegie, was arrested at Scott's Hotel in Melbourne on Sunday for imposition. He has just come from Sydney, where he imposed on some people, saying he expected remittances from England to be sent to the Union Bank in Sydney. A gentleman from Western Australia whom he met advanced him money to come to Melbourne. Subsequently, Carnegie went to one of the banks, asked for an advance of £25 on the strength of expected remittances. As these were not heard of, the bank refused to comply with the request unless someone identified him. He then got the West Australian friend to identify him, and he, on being asked to guarantee the £25 cheque, did so. Subsequently, Carnegie obtained some flowers from Highland the florist to the extent of £2 10 and gave a cheque for £5 on the Union Bank. They gave him 3 shillings change but would not give the rest until the cheque had been presented. The cheque was returned no account and Carnegie never called for the change. When arrested, he admitted all and said he was a son of the late Mr. Carnegie, one time a director of the Orient Company. He was yesterday sent to jail for a month. Detective McNanamy deposed to have arrested the accused at Scott's Hotel, where he was masquerading as Viscount Carnegie. In the course of an interview with the accused, the latter stated that his real title was Earl of North Esk and that he had expected a remittance at the Union Bank, referring to a gentleman at Menzies Hotel who could vouch for him. When the witness interviewed this gentleman, he stated that he wished he'd never seen Carnegie, as the latter had persuaded him to act as guarantor to an overdraft at a Sydney bank for £25 that he now had to pay. The accused was taken into custody, upon which he admitted to witness that he had served a sentence in Vancouver Island and his real name was Percy Whitall. The accused pleaded that when he arrived in Sydney from Vancouver Island, he had money and letters authorising certain credit at the National Bank of Queensland. He'd been drinking hard in Sydney and was suffering from the effects to such an extent that he did not care a hang what he did. Accused stated in reply to the usual questions that he'd been educated at Harrow. As he left the court building en route to the jail, Carnegie jumped upon his hat, calling ecstatically, "That's good enough. I expected 12 months." And on the 12th of October 1895 in the Melbourne Leader, a swell imposter. For cool, unblushing effrontery, the tale in which a swell imposter named Douglas Carnegie gave Saturday last to Detective McNanamy, who had arrested him, is difficult to excel. Carnegie came under Detective McNanamy's notice after a complaint from Mr. Henry Ireland, a florist carrying on business in Burke Street, that said he'd been victimised by a man who styled himself as Viscount Douglas Carnegie. The detective found Viscount Douglas Carnegie, as he is named upon his waiting cards at Scott's Hotel, and asked him whether he had drawn a cheque at a bank where it had no funds. Carnegie said he expected a remittance daily, and then confided to Detective McNanamy that if he took his proper title, he'd be known as the Earl of North Esk. Being pressed for proof, he went to Menzies Hotel and introduced the detective to a gentleman who said that he met Carnegie in Sydney and understood that he was the man that he represented himself to be. He advanced Carnegie sufficient money to travel from Sydney to Melbourne. Carnegie had put up at Menzies on arrival, but the manager, disliking his lack of luggage and general appearance, had requested him to leave, and he had done so, paying his bill readily before he left. Commencing his narrative, he said his name was Douglas Carnegie and that his father, who is now dead, had been the director of the Orient Company and resided at North Esk, Scotland. When 20 years of age, he got into trouble through stealing a friend's jewellery and pawning it. The affair was hushed up and the offender was packed off to Melbourne, where he arrived by the ship Hesperus the year that Bravo won the Melbourne Cup. That was in 1859. He proceeded to New Zealand, and after working as a boundary rider and shepherd, he worked his passage back to England, but his people would not have him and sent him to Ceylon, where for several years he worked on a tea plantation and learnt the Tamil and Sinhalese languages. Troubles drove him from Ceylon and he went to Melbourne in 1892, or as he described it, in Glenloth's year, but he did not remain long. British Columbia was his next home, and he remained there some time and received 9 months' imprisonment for stealing and passed half this time in irons owing to bad behaviour and insubordination. When he was discharged from jail, he took steerage on a passage in a steamer to Sydney, where he arrived last month. At first he stayed, alternatively, at the Australia Hotel and the Grand Central Coffee Palace, but when he had no funds to pay for his rooms, he was content to put up with the more modest comforts of the sailor home. At the police court on Monday, he admitted his real name was Percy Whitall. He said that he arrived in Sydney from Vancouver Island. He had money and letters authorising certain credit at the National Bank of Queensland. And then on the 2nd of November 1895, in the Queensland Warwick Argus, it added a little more detail about how Douglas Carnegie described his history. He said that he came from Ceylon when he was tea planting to Victoria, and Captain White of the Ormuz gave him free passage. He said, "I came once more to Victoria in Glenloth's year and lived then at Port Phillip Club. Captain White of the Ormuz gave me a free passage to Colombo and then to England. I got mixed up in a breach of promise case. I then served time in a Canadian jail for a false charge of theft of a watch, and this sickened me of America, and I returned to Sydney as a steerage passenger in one of the big boats. While in Sydney, I put up at the Hotel Australia when I had money, and at the Sailors' Home when I had none. Then I came to Victoria, and here you are." And it just made a note that he was arrested at Scott's, and he'd stayed at the Menzies in Melbourne. In the Sydney Daily Telegraph on the 9th of October 1895, it says, "We have been asked to state that the Percy Whitall, alias Viscount Douglas Carnegie, who was sentenced to a month's imprisonment in Melbourne on Monday, is not Mr. Percy Whitall, late of Mount Victoria." So the jury's out on that one. I beg to differ. I think that he's left in disgrace. He's had one attempt desperately at getting money after being bankrupt, and I think he decided he'd go to Melbourne and try his luck to see whether he'd swindle there. There was nothing else for quite a while, not until the 19th of June 1912 in the Lithgow Mercury, where it says, "An erstwhile prominent citizen of Mount Victoria, Mr. Percy G. Whitall, for many years proprietor of the Imperial Hotel in its time of glory, paid a flying visit during the week. Mr. Whitall was a guest of Mr. Raynett's. He's now located on the north coast and by all accounts is running a most prosperous dairy farm." So it seems that he's realised that by trying to cut corners, it wasn't going to work out for him, and so he's taken his family down to the coast and seems to be doing quite well. On the 5th of May 1916, in the Lismore Northern Star, it announced new magistrates, and Percy George Whitall was listed at Mullumbimby. On the 12th of December 1918, in the Mullumbimby Star, Percy G. Whitall is the chairman of directors for the Mullumbimby Cooperative Butching Company Limited, so it seems that he's back being an erstwhile citizen in his community. Percy died on the 15th of April 1920 at Mullumbimby in New South Wales. On the 17th of April 1920, in the Murwillumbah Tweed Daily, there was an obituary for Percy Whitall. Residents of Mullumbimby and the district around were shocked of hearing the death at his home on Thursday at midday of Mr. Percy George Whitall, one of the best known and most highly esteemed residents. The deceased had been in failing health for some time past, although he was not obliged to take his bed until Saturday last. On that day, he was overcome whilst in the street and was ordered to bed. He seemed better on the Thursday, and at 11 a.m. was in conversation with an old friend, Mr. Rollo. He was left alone for a short while, and on again entering the sick room, members of the family were grieved to find that the soul had taken its long last flight. The late Mr. Whittle was 66 years of age. He was born in 1854, the second year of the Crimean War, in Constantinople. He was subsequently educated at the Isle of Man and gave up college life to engage in the tea trade in China, holding the position of tester for many years. 7 years more was spent in the employ of Jardine, Matheson and Company, traders in the East. He had a big fund of stories to relate of his experiences in these countries. Coming to Australia in 1879, Mr. Whittle went to Mount Victoria, where he married Miss Grace Perry, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Perry of Windsor. He took over the Imperial Hotel in that town and also ran a line of coaches to the Jenolan Caves. He left Mount Victoria with his family in 1890 and was engaging in business pursuits in Sydney until the year of 1907. The family, now grown up, the deceased decided to go on the land and was attracted to the Mullumbimby district, where he has lived ever since, a period of 13 years. He sold out his farm at Wilson's Creek only a month or so ago, after having purchased a residence in the township to pass the evening of his life. Mr. Whittle, with his good wife, was the essence of hospitality and possessed many true friends. In the public life of the community, he played an outstanding part, being associated with every movement making for the betterment and advancement of the district. For several years he was president of the Mullumbimby Agricultural Society, and at his death was senior vice president. As chairman of directors for the Mullumbimby Butchering Company, he also displayed marked ability and enthusiasm. The local branch of the PP Union owes much of its past success to his wholehearted work as honorary secretary. When the local repatriation committee was formed, Mr. Whittle's choice as one of its members was unanimous, and he has since proved his worth here. An honoured justice of the peace, the deceased had from time to time held a seat on the local bench. In church matters, he also took a keen interest and was on the parochial council of the Church of England. The deceased leaves a widow and a family of 3 sons and 5 daughters. Mr. H.E. Whittle, a returned lad, resides at Springfield, Sydney, where he is recovering from a serious illness contracted whilst on active service. Edward Whittle, a returned soldier, and Jack Whittle. A 4th son, Percy George Whittle, was killed in action at Lone Pine on the 17th of August 1915. The daughters are Mrs. Lawrence of Lismore, Mrs. W.A. Sharp of Goonageri, Mrs. J. Hart of Wilson's Creek, and Mrs. E. and R. Whittle, who reside at home. There are 10 grandchildren. Reverend Quinlan of Eureka held the funeral service and said that it was an appropriate address which referred to the highest qualities possessed by the deceased, to his public duties well and truly performed, and to the fact that he'd been a truly good husband and father. 6 members of the parochial council acted as pallbearers. The funeral cortege was an exceedingly long one. At the graveside was assembled a gathering of citizens representing every public institution with which the deceased had been associated, and friends of the family from many parts. And on the 23rd of March 1927, in the Lithgow Mercury, Govet's Leap, how it was named. Govet's Leap, the famous waterfall of Blackheath, was called after surveyor W.R. Govett, but there are still a good many people who believe that it was named because a convict, Govett, leapt over it. In 1887, in the Lithgow Enterprise, it published a story that was described as a true story of Govett, told by Mr. P.G. Whittle. Years ago, 2 boys played together on the lawn of a ducal mansion in an English Midland county. One of these boys was Percy G. Whittle, the son of the owner of the lordly park around and the descendant of 100 belted earls, and the other, Miltinders P. Govett, his cousin from America. Often these two would end an angry discussion about the relative merits of British and American pluck by fighting to the finish, the youthful Govett being mostly overthrown. Miltinders went back to America, and for many years the cousins never heard of anything of each other. The War of the Roses had been agitating England for some time, and a young Whittle fought under Richard III at Bosworth Field. When the crook-backed tyrant offered his kingdom for a horse, Percy, seeing a big thing in it, went off to fetch one, which he had seen Catesby plant behind a hedge in case of an emergency. that one of Shallow Richmond's Welsh volunteers had found out the horse and shifted it, and thus it happens that the Whittles are not now the reigning family of Great Britain. As a result of that disastrous day, the Whittle estates were confiscated and young Percy escaped to New South Wales disguised as a trade union lecturer. He was at once appointed to a high government post in the colony, and one day when going across the Blue Mountains he saw among a gang of fettered convicts toiling at the construction of the Victoria Pass, and he saw a face he knew. It was Miltindus Govett. His story was a pathetic one. After having covered himself with glory at the mighty struggle of the Bull's Run, he'd had a moment of abstraction, so far forgotten himself as to rob a dead fellow soldier. This action, regarded with disfavour by the authorities, he also had escaped to Australia in the disguise of an English duke. Arriving in Sydney, he again committed an error of judgment by stealing a portmanteau off a bush missionary. For this he was sentenced to 56 years of hard labour in irons on the public roads in the colony. But he was still game and taunted his free cousin with the fact that no Englishman had ever dared to despoil a bush missionary. Not heeding this scorn, Whittle turned his horse's head and rode through the day and night in the direction of Sydney. He arrived there and sought the commandment, and by bringing great influence to bear, secured a pardon for his cousin. Armed with this, he rode back to the Victoria Pass. In the meantime, the irrepressible Govett had escaped. Watching his opportunity one day, while the chaplain was exhorting the gloomy gang of chained criminals, he crept away unobserved and reached the reverend gentleman's horse. His feet were ironed together, but to the American mind few obstacles are insurmountable. He laid himself flat on his back on the ground and, lifting the feet of the docile horse, placed them one by one between his legs. He then pulled down the head of the animal also, and climbing up over it, sat on the saddle back to front with his feet fastened together under the horse. Then with a yell of defiance he seized the reins behind him like tiller ropes and dashed on. The animal instinctively took the road to Sydney, along which Percy Whittle was returning with a free pardon. At what is now Blackheath, that gentleman was amazed to see a maddened steed, with a man apparently bound on its back, tear into the bush leading to the brink of the Valley of Death. In a moment he wheeled around and gave chase, and a fearful race began. His horse gained rapidly on the worn-out animal of the escapee. He drew nearer and recognised his long-lost cousin, and understood his position. He waved the pardon on high and cried, "Stop! There is death before you, stop!" "Minion," shouted the other, likewise debased royalist, "a blasted Britisher, I will not stop. Follow me if you dare." And with these words he and his foam-covered horse dashed over the ragged edge of the yet unchristened leap and ricocheted magnificently into the unknown. Long afterwards they lifted the remains of a dead man to the top of the cliff by means of grappling irons, and these are now buried in a quiet spot near the place where they have immortalised in becoming remains. Mr. Whittle has sent to Scotland for a monument to erect over the place where his lost relative lies, and during the summer months will derive a solemn pleasure from driving visitors at so much per head to see Govett's grave. One of the leg irons of the dead man, having on it a monogram of SPG in a broad arrow, is in the possession of Postmaster Grott. The jawbone of his horse, a treasured relic, is used to beat the breakfast gong at the Imperial Hotel. I don't know what you think, but I think that's quite a tall tale by Percy George Whittle, which now makes that 1894 case of him stating that he was from nobility, running along those same lines. Percy and Grace's children. The firstborn, Elsie Caroline Percy Whittle, was born on the 16th of September 1880 near Lithgow. She married Oscar William Lawrence on the 22nd of April 1908 at the Whittle family home at Goonangerry, when Elsie was 27 and Oscar 28. They had 4 children. Oscar died in 1934, and then Elsie married George Hanger in Brisbane on the 11th of April 1935. Elsie died on the 15th of April 1951 at Kyogle, New South Wales, aged 70. The second-born was Florence Estelle Percy Whittle, who was born in 1882 at Perry's Hotel at Mount Victoria. She did not marry and died on the 12th of July 1957 at Byron Bay, New South Wales, aged 75. The third child was Grace Ruby Percy Whittle, who was born on the 25th of February 1883 at Mount Victoria. She married Frederick George Trice, who was known as Gunner, in Granville, New South Wales in 1922, when she was 39 and Frederick 38. They had a daughter, Estelle, in 1925, and Grace died on the 12th of July 1959 in North Parramatta, New South Wales, aged 76. The fourth child was Charlton Arthur Percy Whittle, who was born on the 28th of July 1884 at Mount Victoria. In 1913 in Tamworth, his occupation was listed as a drill instructor, and he married Mary Baldwin in Tamworth in 1915. On the 11th of January 1919 in the Tamworth Daily Observer, it says Staff Sergeant Major Charlton Whittle will be remembered by residents of Tamworth as having been attached to the local military forces not long before the war. He married Miss Mary Baldwin and removed to Sydney. When the war broke out, he was refused permission to enlist, so he procured his discharge and went to England with his wife and child, where he enlisted in the Guards and was soon promoted again to Sergeant Major. News of his death has lately been received, but it's not known whether he was killed in action or died of illness. The sympathy of her former friends will go out to his widow, who was well known in Tamworth, where her father for some years conducted a boys' grammar school. The next child is Cecil Nelson Percy Whittle, who was born on the 14th of August 1886 at their residence at Mount Victoria. She married William Ashmore Schaeff in Byron Bay on the 17th of July 1916 when she was 29 and William was 56. They had 6 children, and Cecil died on the 25th of April 1955 at Kyogle, New South Wales, aged 68. There was a notice in the paper upon her death. Mrs. Cecil Schaeff. St Martin's Church of England, Mullumbimby, was filled with capacity, and many had to stand outside of the funeral service of the late Mrs. Cecil Schaeff. The large congregation and the crowd at the graveside was evidence of the esteem in which the late Mrs. Schaeff was held throughout the Richmond and Brunswick districts. Canon Rowe of Lismore paid high tribute to the work of Mrs. Schaeff during her 40 years in those districts. Pallbearers were the 5 sons, Percy, Jack, Bill, Howard and Roger, and her son-in-law S. Charlton. Some 15 friends formed a guard of honour from the church entrance to the street. The 6th child was Howard Edward Whittle. He was born on the 13th of December 1887 at their residence at Mount Victoria. He enlisted in World War I in Brisbane on the 2nd of June 1915. He was a farmer at the time of his enlistment, and his father was listed as his next of kin. Howard embarked from Brisbane on the 20th of August 1915 on the Shropshire. He served in France and Egypt, and he married Marjorie Kathleen Cowley whilst on active service on the 26th of February 1918 in Lancashire, England. He rose to sergeant and returned to Australia on the 1st of August 1918 due to kidney trouble. They had 2 sons. In 1937 he was farming at Smithfield, New South Wales, and he died on the 2nd of December 1947 at Liverpool, aged 59. And on the 4th of December 1947 in the Fairfield Biz, Mr. Howard Edward Whittle, a well-known resident of Sherwood Grange and Smithfield, occurred last Tuesday. His wife predeceased him 9 years ago and is survived by sons Peter and Yule. The 7th child was Percy George Whittle Jr., who was born in 1889 at their residence in Mount Victoria. He died on the 7th of August 1915 at the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey, and he embarked from Brisbane on the 24th of September 1914. He was only 25 when he died. On the 8th of September 1915 in the Lithgow Mercury, it announced the death of Percy. It said he was educated at the Chatswood Public School and moved with his parents to the North Coast 8 years ago. He was a single man and before enlisting was in the employ of Mr. A. Cowdery, licensed surveyor of Lismore. He left with the first contingent of the Light Horse, the Queensland Expeditionary Force, and has been in the firing line since the commencement of operations at the Dardanelles. He is the son of Mr. P.G. Whittle of Mullumbimby, and 2 of his brothers have enlisted. The 8th child, Edward Mountford Percy Whittle, known as Ted, was born on the 3rd of June 1890 at Lithgow. He enlisted in World War I on the 10th of August 1915 and was also a farmer at the time of his enlistment and named his father as his next of kin. He served as a driver in France and returned to Australia in April 1919, marrying Myra Pearl Rollo on the 12th of December 1923 in Mullumbimby. He was 36 and Myra 29, and they had 2 children. He died in an accident on the 7th of January 1932 near Lismore, aged only 41, and the Mullumbimby Star outlined this accident on the 14th of January 1932. Death came suddenly under tragic circumstances on Thursday to Ted Whittle of Rathdowney, Queensland. Mr. Whittle, who had an extensive hauling plant, was under contract at the time of his death to Garrix Limited of Brisbane. With his wife and family, he journeyed to Mullumbimby to spend Christmas with his people, but owing to pressures of business, he returned the following Monday. On Thursday last, he was to proceed to a log dump accompanied by Mr. Hugh Thompson and a boy, when without warning or known reason, the lorry suddenly swerved and brought up against fallen timber about 2 chains down. Whittle and Thompson were thrown violently from the lorry just as it took the first plunge. The boy remained until it stopped and was unhurt. Mr. Thompson suffered from shock and severe abrasions to the head and shoulders. He quickly found Mr. Whittle, who was then unconscious, but his efforts to bring him round were unavailing as the base of his skull was fractured and also his right leg. A passing motorist took word to Tylerville, from where the ambulance was dispatched, arriving at 5:30, 2 hours after the accident. A dash was made, but Mr. Whittle passed away near Laraval and was taken to the morgue at Beaudesert. The funeral took place at St. Martin's Church on Saturday. Returned soldiers formed a guard of honour outside the church as the casket was being borne to the hearse and again from the cemetery gates to the grave. The late Mr. Whittle leaves a wife and 2 small children, Paddy aged 6 years and Billy 4 years. A mother and 2 brothers, Jack, Bill and Nudgel and Howard of Marylands, and 4 sisters, Mrs. Schaaf, Gunageri, Mrs. Hart, Markham, Mrs. Lawrence of Coingla, and Mrs. Trice of Sydney, and Miss Estelle Whittle of Mullumbimby. To them, the sympathy of the whole district is extended for Ted, who was beloved in the Brunswick district. The late Mr. Whittle served in the Great War and seemed to bear a charmed life, for he came through the great conflict unscathed. Enlisting in August 1915, he left Australia as a driver in the 3rd DAC in November 1915. He saw service in Egypt and went to France in May 1916, where his unit with the 106th Battery and of the 6th Mobile Artillery Brigade, in which he served until April 1918, being sent to England on artillery drivers' instructional staff. He served without wound or serious illness, and on his return he engaged in banana growing at Wilson's Creek and later timber getting in southern Queensland. The next children were twin girls, Inez and Yvonne, who were born on the 20th of June 1891 at their residence at Mount Victoria. Inez Hermer Percy Whittle married John Hart of Wilson's Creek on the 15th of April 1914 when she was 22 and John 31. They had 7 children, and Inez died on the 29th of March 1968 at Bengaluru, New South Wales, aged 76. The other twin, Yvonne Adeline Percy Whittle, died at the age of 16 months on the 23rd of October 1892 at her parents' residence at Mount Victoria. And these children came in quick succession, so what's interesting is that the last child was born 7 years after the twins. So the twins were born in the middle of 1891 and Jack Edgar Percy Whittle was born in 1898. So whether that correlates with Percy with his misdemeanours, particularly the one in Melbourne that occurred, maybe he went AWOL for a while and then returned to the family. Jack was born in Ryde, New South Wales and married Elsie Mildred Mitchell in Byron Bay on the 6th of February 1924. They had 3 children and he died on the 5th of June 1968 in Lismore at the age of 70. So the article that was placed to say that the Percival George Whittle that was charged in Victoria was not the same man, I'll leave that up for you to decide.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.